Let's talk about the cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are a big deal. Cranial nerves have a lot to do with your special senses, vision, smell, hearing, taste. So anytime there's some sort of impairment with your special senses, cranial nerves might be suspect. Cranial nerves have to do with facial movement, facial expressions, and facial sensations. Also the movement of your neck. They have a lot to do with the parasympathetic nervous system control over your internal organs. So cranial nerves are a big deal. This is a topic that's not going away. Now they're called cranial nerves because they come out of the head, and that might make you think that they're part of the central nervous system, but they're not. They emerge from the central nervous system. They're peripheral. Don't mix that up. A lot of people get that wrong on quizzes and exams. They're peripheral nervous system, okay? So cranial nerves, those of you heading for nursing, first semester of nursing school, you'll have to learn how to do a bedside exam for the cranial nerves. So this is not going away. It's important. It's a big deal. First thing you have to know about cranial nerves is they're numbered using Roman numerals, which is wacky stuff. It's not my fault. There's nothing I can do about it. It happened before I was born. But you have to learn Roman numerals. They're not hard. I'll mark it wrong if you don't use Roman numerals, all right? It's just a tradition. It's not up to me. It's the way it's done, okay? So Roman numeral 1 is just an I, okay? 2 is I. 3 is I, and so 4 will be I, right? No, those are wacky Romans. They decided that 5 was V, and so to make 4, they made 5 minus 1. So it's IV, just like you'd put in somebody's arm, all right? IV, 5 is V, and then 6 is 5 plus 1, VI, all right? 7 is VII, 5 plus 2. 8 is VIII, 5 plus 3. Oh my God, can you believe they do this? Marcellus, how many beers are left in the refrigerator? 5 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. Marcellus, get away from the fridge, you're drunk, sit down. All right, so that's 8. So 9, you might think VIII. No, the Romans decided that 10 was an X. So to do 9, we have to do IX, 10 minus 1, okay? Then 10 is X. 11 is XI, 10 plus 1, and then 12 is XII, 10 plus 2. All right, just get used to it. No wonder the Romans, lost control of, got overrun. They were overrun by the barbarians, the Huns and the Goths and the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and everything. I mean, it's no wonder. It's like, Claudius, the barbarians are coming across the field towards us. How many are there? Well, let's see, I think there's D, C, 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 L, X, X. They made it across the field and killed him before he could finish saying the number, all right? So let's start looking at the names of the cranial nerves. Number 1 is olfactory, all right? Olfactory, this has to do with smell, all right? Olfactory, smell. Number 2, optic, obviously has to do with vision, okay? Number 3, olfactory. Olfactory. I just said olfactory. What is happening here? 3 is oculomotor. So oculomotor, just think about that word for a minute. Oculo, eye, motor, move. 3, oculomotor, this moves the eye. Oculomotor moves the eye. 4, trochlea, this is another one that moves the eye. It's named for the Greek root word meaning pulley, and that's because the muscle goes through a little pulley. The names really do make sense if you know a little of the background. 5 is the trigeminal. Trigeminal has 3 big branches. This is the biggest cranial nerve. It's a good landmark when you're trying to spot them on the brainstem, which is where they emerge from. 6 is abducens, same root word as abduct. And that's because it abducts your eye, causes your eye to go over to the side. So notice so far 3, 5, and 6 3, 4, and 6 all move the eye. I'm going to recommend that you group cranial nerves by function. That will help you remember them better. 7, we're now at the facial nerve. Facial nerve, what do you suppose it has to do with? Yeah, what's big and red and eats rocks? A big red rock eater. What does the facial nerve deal with? Facial. This is the movement of your facial muscles, all right? So, and some other things as well. 8, this is vestibulocochlear. Vestibulocochlear. It used to be called the auditory or acoustic nerve, and that will help if you remember that because it has to do with hearing. But as it turns out, once we look inside the ear, we'll see there's what's called the Bony Labyrinth, a big bony structure. And it has two parts. The cochlea comes from the Greek word for snail, and then vestibule, which is like a little side chamber. So vestibulocochlear refers to the fact that it has the vestibule and the cochlea. And the cochlea is for hearing, the vestibule is for balance. So this is the nerve for balance and hearing, all right? If you remember that, it makes it easier, all right? 9 is Glosso Pharyngeal. And there are a couple of root words here that if you get to know them, they'll make your life easier. Glosso means tongue. Anytime you see glosso, it usually means tongue. Pharyngeal, pharynx is your throat. So what does this cranial nerve have to do with the throat and the tongue? This is a cranial nerve that has to do with the muscles of speech and swallowing, okay? Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus. So think for a minute. Do you know of any other words that have VAG as a root? And no, not vagina, that's a different root. Oh my God, I'm so ashamed of you. No, think of any other words with, like a vague idea, like a vagabond, like a vagrant. This means wandering, all right? A wanderer. A vague idea is an idea that wanders. So the vagus nerve emerges from the cranium, but it goes all the way down through your thorax and into your abdomen. This is how the parasympathetic nervous system gets info from your internal organs and sends commands to them. So this is a very important nerve in terms of autonomic function. Cranial nerve number 11 rather, is called the accessory. Really its full name is the spinal accessory. There's actually some talk about whether this should be considered a cranial nerve because it emerges from the spinal cord and then comes up, goes through foramen magnum and into the brain. At any rate, it's going to have to do with moving the neck muscles, okay? So it really, again, should be spinal accessory, but for years it's been listed just as accessory. But if you remember it's spinal accessory, that helps you remember that it's the one that comes out of the spinal cord. And then number 11 is hypoglossal. So once again, if you remember that root word I just told you, glosso, tongue, hypo, under, so this is the nerve that controls the stuff under your tongue. Remember when we looked at the bones, we saw that underneath the occipital condyles on the occipital bone was the hypoglossal canal. That's where the hypoglossal nerve goes. So once again, this is a nerve that's going to have to do with the muscles of speech and swallowing. So see, there's a lot of info here. If you just keep it straight, it'll help you. Now then, in addition to knowing the names and functions of every cranial nerve and their Roman numeral, you're also going to have to know whether they're sensory or motor or both. So some cranial nerves are strictly sensory. All they do is bring information to the brain. Others are strictly motor. They take commands from the brain and send them out to the body. Others do both, all right? So they're both sensory and motor. So here's what we do. So, cranial nerve number 1, strictly sensory. 2, strictly sensory. Oculomotor is strictly motor. Now, in fact, it has a little bit of sensory. In fact, all the cranial nerves, almost all the cranial nerves, not all, not 1, not 2, most of the cranial nerves have a little bit of each. But they're like 99% one or the other, and I want you to think of them that way. I want you to think of number 3 as a motor nerve, even though it has a tiny bit of sensory. And we'll talk about that in the PowerPoint. Trochlear, motor. Trigeminal is the first one that's truly both. It's got a lot of sensory and a lot of motor, right? Abducens, really just motor for the most part. Facial, a lot of both, all right? Vestibulocochlear, sensory. Glossopharyngeal, vagus, these are the ones that also have a lot of both sensory and motor. 11 and 12, really just mostly motor, all right? Now, how can you remember that? Well, I have a little thing that I learned. Some say marry money, but my brother says big somethings matter most. And you can choose whatever you want for the somethings there. So some say marry money, but my brother says big somethings matter most. And of course, the best choice here would be brains, because that is what matters most. But if you have something else you prefer, go right ahead. Now, in terms of remembering the cranial nerves and the numbers, there are lots of ways to do it. The one I learned was on old Olympia's towering top, a fine vested German vaults and hops. So think about an old German guy wearing lederhosen with a little white beard and the funny hat, and he's up on top of Mount Olympus and he's got his pole vault and he's vaulting and hopping. On old Olympia's towering top, a fine vested German vaults and hops. Now if you want to waste about an hour, Google dirty cranial nerve mnemonics. And oh my God, medical students have been making up truly nasty, dirty, filthy things. Which I'm not going to tell you. I will tell you one. There was a contest, I think it was at the Duke Medical School a few years back, to see who could come up with the best one. This one's just kind of like PG. But the winner was, olive oil often treats testicles after frisky virgins give very aggressive hand jobs. And we're going to leave it right there.